In this video, we're going to talk about shifts in labor demand and labor supply. Much of this should seem pretty familiar because the effects of shifts in demand and supply are very similar to those in the output market. However, because the roles of buyers and sellers are reversed, it's going to be helpful if we look at this in a little bit more detail. In an earlier video, we noted that for any firm in a competitive labor market, the labor demand curve is the firm's marginal revenue product curve. We know that in general, marginal revenue product equals marginal revenue times marginal product. And if the output market happens to be competitive, this would become the value of the marginal product, which is price times marginal product. But this more general formulation will work no matter what the nature of the output market is, because ultimately it's the marginal revenue that's generated from the additional output produced by one more worker that affects the firm's decisions. Because the labor demand curve for a firm is its marginal revenue product curve, anything that affects either marginal revenue or marginal product or both will affect the demand for labor. So if either marginal revenue or marginal product rises, labor demand will increase. Thinking in terms of the impact on marginal revenue, one of the things you learn early in your economics course is that the demand for resources is a derived demand. It's derived from the demand for output. If there's more demand for output, there will be more demand for labor. That's what's depicted in this diagram. Basically, if there's more demand for apples, there's going to be more demand for apple pickers. If there's more demand for cars, there's going to be more demand for auto workers. If there's more demands for healthcare, there's going to be more demand for healthcare workers. And the reason for this is that when there's an increase in the demand for output, it raises the marginal revenue received from the sale of that output. And that's why the labor demand curve shifts. The value of the output produced by the workers is now greater than it was before. The effect of productivity and marginal product is one which often seems counterintuitive. Given that the labor demand curve for a firm is its marginal revenue product curve, whenever marginal product rises, labor demand must rise. And the reason why that may not seem intuitive is that students, when they first see this, will think, well, if workers are more productive, you don't need as many of them. It doesn't quite work that way, though. Let's consider an example. If the productivity of workers in fast food restaurants rise, then fast food prices will be lower, and the quantity of fast food demanded would increase, leading to an increase in the demand for labor. Also, note that firms have the choice of many different inputs they can use. In the simplest case, they have a choice between labor and capital. If labor becomes relatively more productive compared to other inputs, firms will choose to use more of the labor input and less of the other inputs. So anything that makes one type of labor more productive will lead to an increase in employment of that. More generally, though, there's a variety of determinants of demand, primarily because it affects either marginal revenue or marginal product, or will affect the number of firms demanding labor. Specifically, as we just noted, the demand for the final product is an important determinant of demand because the demand for labor is derived from the demand for that output. Worker productivity, as we've just noted, is a factor that affects the demand for labor. Technology affects the marginal product of resources, and in general, technological change may either favor the use of more labor, more capital, or perhaps may lead to cost improvements that will result in an increase in the demand for both labor and capital. But technological change will certainly affect the mix of workers that are demanded. Some jobs may become obsolete. In other cases, it may create whole new job categories. The effect will depend to a large extent on the nature of the technological change. One factor that will be important, though, is the prices of other resources, because firms have to choose a mix of resources that are being used, and other resources may either serve as substitutes to labor or complements to labor. If a substitute resource becomes less expensive, the demand for labor will fall. If a substitute resource becomes more expensive, there'll be more demand for that category of labor. Complements, as you recall in the output market, are things that tend to be used together. For example, automated production processes and computer programmers may be complements in production. Assembly line workers and capital that's used to perform the same task would be likely to be substitutes. One of the things we've observed in recent decades is that low-skilled workers are more likely to be replaced by capital than high-skilled workers. In particular, many low-skilled workers serve as substitutes for capital, while many high-skilled workers and workers with more education are more likely to be complements to capital in production processes, which is one of the reasons why the demand has increased for workers with college degrees relative to the demand for less skilled workers. Taxes, subsidies, and labor laws also will affect the cost of labor and will have some impact on the quantity of labor demanded. Looking very briefly at the determinants of labor supply, one major factor will be the number of workers supplying labor. Another factor will be the value of time in alternative uses. Specifically, if time becomes more valuable in either another occupation or in some non-market activity, we'll see fewer people working in a particular job. On the other hand, if the value of time in other uses goes down, if wages in other occupations go down, or if the value of time in other tasks that workers could be doing becomes lower for any reason, we'd expect to see an increase in the supply of labor. Taxes, subsidies, and labor laws could also have some impact on the amount of labor that individual workers choose to provide. Now, let's put all of this together and consider the effect of an increase in immigration. Most people, when they think about an increase in immigration, tend to think only of the effect on labor supply, and that's illustrated here. If there's an increase in the supply of labor and nothing else changes, we'd expect to see lower wages but more employment. Workers who are already in the country would end up having lower wages, and the increase in employment will not be as large as the increase in the number of workers. So some workers that were already working could lose their jobs to immigrant workers if the supply of labor increases. So we end up with lower wages for all workers if this is the only thing that happens. However, what many people do not take into account is that when there's an increase in immigration, there's going to be an increase in the demand for output. That increase in the demand for output will lead to more demand for labor, and that increase in the demand for labor will lead to higher wages and more employment. So when we consider both the effects of the shift in demand and supply, is that employment will clearly rise because the increase in the supply of labor and the increase in the demand for labor will, in all labor markets, lead to higher employment. The effect on wages, though, will vary. The increase in demand leads to higher wages. The increase in supply leads to lower wages. So what we'll see is that wages will go up in those labor markets where the demand for labor shifts by more than the supply of labor does. Wages will fall in those labor markets where supply shifts by more than demand. So the effect on wages in any market will depend on the relative magnitude of the shifts in demand and supply in that particular labor market. If a large proportion, for example, of immigrants are radiologists, we might expect to see a decline in the wage rate for radiologists, but an increase in wages in many other industries because these new radiologists will still be buying other things, which will require more labor to produce those other things. So in general, the effect on wages cannot be clearly predicted, and that's something you have to determine empirically. We might expect to see the net effect being essentially neutral. Roughly speaking, if there's a 2% increase in the labor force, there's also going to be roughly a 2% increase in the demand for output, which together will lead to essentially offsetting effects.